And they really understate how much work actually goes into this. It's remarkable. I texted Kevin a couple times and Andy and Tessa over the last few months, like, hey, do you have 5 minutes to run something by you? And 2.5 hours later, we'd be ending the call. So these guys were amazing. So thanks for having me, and thanks for all your help. My name's Brett Buchanan. I will tell you a little bit about myself professionally. I have worked for some startups. My first job out of college was for Abercrombie & Fitch. I was a product manager there for 3 years, back in 2007 to 2010 kind of range. And I worked for Gap for the last 6 years, most recently. When I started at Gap, I was one of 14 product managers, and when I left Gap, we had 250 product managers, so we saw a ton of growth. I got to see, it was an amazing experience to see how product could have an impact in such a large company. I went to UD for undergrad. I got my MBA from Ohio State in 2013, just at nights and on the weekends. I also helped run a meetup club similar to this called the Columbus Product Club. We have a monthly meetup similar to this. We also have a coffee and connections the first Tuesday. It's kind of like a networking thing. And then we do a happy hour the second Thursday of every month. A few years ago, someone said, hey, it's great that we meet once a month for an hour, but we should try to do something all day. I was like, well, that sounds a lot like a conference. And so we put on a conference with, none of us had really any kind of event planning background. That conference is called Lift. This is the third year of it. It's April 23rd. The first year we had 250 people. Last year there was over 400 people. And then this year we're expecting somewhere around 450 to 500 people. So I'd definitely check it out. We also do a unconference called Product Camp Columbus. That happens in the fall. It's generally free or like $10 to go to it. And it's an amazing, like, high energy opportunity where 200 or 300 people come together and share different ideas. And the agenda is actually developed that day. Most recently, I started a product management consulting company, a small firm here in Columbus. And so what we've been doing over the last 15 months is helping companies improve and build out their product management practices. I'm also a family man. This is my crew. This is us this Christmas, picking out our Christmas tree. These are my kids. Luca's 7, Millie is 6 on the left. Bowen is 4, and Shep is 1. They look really cute. Don't let them fool you. They're great. So why I'm here today, we're going to be talking about the Northstar framework. And I'm not actually a huge framework person. I'm not a huge tools person, not huge on process. But what I like about the Northstar framework is that it helps improve your focus and increase your decision making. The other thing that I really like about this is that it solves a couple problems that I think a lot of companies in Columbus especially are experiencing, and we'll kind of talk about that. So this talk isn't just about the framework itself. It's actually about how we work as teams within our companies. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. One of the things I really like about my job is that I get to talk to a ton of different types of people at different types of companies. I think in the last 6 months, I've probably talked to almost every enterprise in Columbus. And so there's some really interesting observations and patterns that have came out of those meetings. The first is that executives or management is struggling hitting the growth goals that they're trying to achieve, right? The second observation, and I call this group makers. These are like developers, product managers, designers, analysts are consistently telling me that they don't feel connected to the bigger picture and that they're being handed specifications to go and build something and they don't feel like they can contribute ideas as equals. And it feels very like dev shoppy. These two problems sound disconnected, but they're actually very much related. And that's why I like the Northstar framework. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about, is how to apply this framework not only to help set your strategy, but also to create a more autonomous way of working, ultimately leading to alignment here. So these are the steps that we'll be talking through. There's really 4 steps in using this framework. The first is setting your vision. And this is really what the agenda is going to be for the rest of the talk. It's these 4 things. Setting your vision, determining your Northstar metric, setting the goal, and communicating and tying it all together. I'm probably going to get through a couple of these pretty quickly so that we can focus on some of the key points. So we'll go through setting the vision pretty quickly. Vision is important because no strategy exists without a vision, because you really need to know where you're going, right? And I really like this definition of vision. Roger Kaufman wrote a book called Mega Thinking. Measurable world that we want to create. I like to use Mario as an example. Kevin got very, very excited about this. I like to use Mario as an example of how to describe vision. Does anyone know what the image on the right is? You probably remember this, right? Fire flower, okay. So in this example of vision, Mario is your customer. The flower is your product. And Fire Mario is your vision. I talk to a lot of executives or management, and they often get their strategy confused with their product. When I ask them what their strategy is, they show me something like a list of 7 projects, or here's our portfolio, or here's the features that we're going to build, and this is our strategy. That's more of a plan than a strategy. And so when you think about your strategy as a plan, it doesn't account for change. It doesn't account for uncertainty. You're measured on your ability to ship those 7 or 8 things that are on your list, right? If you've built something before, whether it's a house or especially software products, you know that there's a ton of uncertainty in that process. And so having a really clear outcome and a really clear vision is going to help you set the guardrails in place and set everyone up and align them on what outcomes you're trying to achieve. And so Mario is your customer, Fireflower is your product, and the world that you're trying to create for Mario is Fire Mario throwing fireballs at your enemy. There's a couple good things that I think a product vision are going to have. It's going to be connected with your larger company goal. It's going to have a clear, easily understood story arc that leads from now into the future. So you understand the current context of things and where you need to head for your future state. And a good vision is going to inspire and engage all members of the team. This is an example of Spotify's vision. I'm not going to read this all to you, but it really captures their customer, the value that they're trying to bring to their customer, and the world they're trying to create. We'll come back to that example here shortly. Some takeaways and tips. When you're crafting your vision, collaborate with the right group of people. This is important so that you don't get to the end of it and you've left people out, you've missed something, and it's also about bringing people along and so that they feel like they're part of it, and that leads to motivating them. If everyone can answer where you'll be at the end of the year and how you've gotten there, then your vision work is done. Meaning it's not just about creating your vision, It's also about communicating it and making sure everyone understands it. And lastly, remember your vision is not your product, it's not the flower, it's the world you want to create for your customer. All right, so once you've set your vision, now it's important to determine your North Star. Thinking back to the definition of a vision, it's the measurable world we want to create. Measurable is the key word here, and this is where the North Star metric fits in. Sean Ellis wrote a book in 2010, so this isn't a new concept, called Hacking Growth, and he defines the North Star metric as the aggregate value that people get from your product. And so that's going to make a lot of sense when we start talking through how to define your North Star metric. There's a company called Amplitude. They're a data analytics company, and I really like how they described how they use the North Star framework. What they've come to find is that companies speak 3 different languages. The language of the business, it's things like profit, growth, revenue, cost structure. They speak the language of the customer, that's pains, gains, goals, jobs, experiences, and the language of the product, features, projects, releases, technology. And the North Star metric is about bringing all those things together. And so it's a leading indicator of success, often revenue. And so it's tying the business and also tying it back to solving some customer problems, and you're doing that through the product. And so it does an excellent job of tying your customer, your product, and your business all together. And we'll go through an example here in a few slides. There's 3 characteristics of a North Star metric. The first is how you will measure value for your customer, and this isn't things like page views or ads. Those aren't things that provide value to your customer. How do these things align to your product vision? It's critical that it's tying back to where you want to go as a company. And then lastly, is it a leading indicator of revenue? We said that the North Star metric is all about tying together your business and your profitability and your cost structure. So it's important that it's also a leading indicator for revenue. There are 4 components. The first is breadth. It's the number of users doing that critical action. The second is depth, which is the depth of engagement for that critical event. And we're going to go through an example with Spotify on the next slide. Frequency is how often does that event happen. And then efficiency, which I don't always use, is how quickly do they go through that loop. So Spotify makes 90% of their revenue through paid subscribers. Okay? 10% of their revenue comes from ad revenue from people who are using the free subscription. What Spotify has found is that for paid subscribers, the average hours of music that a listener listens to per month is 75 hours. For their free users, it's only 25 hours. Okay? So what I want to do is kind of, with that understanding, kind of walk through what we think their North Star metric might be. What do we think the breadth component would be? It's the listeners. How about the depth component? Yeah, exactly. How much are they listening? What's their content engagement? And then the frequency component? Yep. How many sessions they have? What's their listening frequency? And so Spotify's North Star metric is the time spent by subscribers listening to music. They use these 3 components to arrive at that. And why this is important is they understand that all of their product decisions need to be focused on driving people to listen to more music every month. because they know that if they can get to 75 hours, they're going to be able to convert that user from a free user to a paid user, and that's where 90% of their revenue is coming from. So the framework isn't just about the metric itself. What's also really important is establishing goals or outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I really like this quote of how they describe strategy. It's the path to deliver on the product vision. Uber's a really good example of this. Their vision is smarter transportation with fewer cars and greater access. It's transportation that's safer, cheaper, more reliable, creates more job opportunities and higher incomes for drivers. Not sure about that last part. Did anyone see the? there was a blog post, I think, that went viral last month. Did anyone read that? It was from an Uber driver in Columbus. Yeah. Yeah, it was great, wasn't it? I kind of tend to disagree with this last comment based off that read. So Uber's Northstar metric was originally weekly rides. And what they realized was that they're a two-sided platform, and they didn't account for drivers. And that was a big problem early on for Uber. And so their Northstar metric is set at weekly trips to account for that. Using data, they needed to figure out what are the biggest obstacles or problems standing in the way of us impacting weekly trips. And what they found was that when the average pickup time from the time that someone requests a ride to the ride actually showing up is greater than 8 minutes, they have a high likelihood of canceling the ride and using an alternative form of transportation in the future. So it was a huge problem for Uber early on. And so they set an outcome for their teams to solve that problem. That was a lagging indicator. It was something that was really, really difficult for the teams at Uber to have a direct impact on. So what they needed to look for was a leading indicator. And what they found was that if they have a driver to rider ratio of 1 to 50, then they're going to be able to accomplish their goal of reducing the average pickup time by less than 8 minutes. So this was huge for them from a scalability perspective. And next, what they needed to look at is what are all the input metrics that are going to help us as a team drive that rider to driver ratio up. So they started looking at things like, how many applications for drivers were started, how many of those applications did their vehicle qualify, and are they abandoning at the background check or insurance and vehicle registration? Are they providing photos for their car? Like, where is the abandonment happening? Are they getting the appropriate training? Like, do they know how to pick up their first customer? And what's really interesting is all of this is happening by the product team itself. And so I kind of want to tie this back to one of the original slides where I mentioned you've got a management team who's doing some planning, maybe some business cases, and determining what projects and what features we're going to build. Well, Uber works differently. They understand what they need to do to drive revenue. They need to increase their weekly trips. What's standing in the way of them doing that? Well, they need to set a goal to reduce the average wait time because they know that their customer lifetime value is decreasing by not hitting that. They're getting rides canceled. The KPI and leading indicator that they're trying to impact is, hey, if we can get to a 1 to 50 ratio, we're not going to have this problem anymore. These input metrics are experiments that they're running to better understand and drive that KPI up. So they're taking pictures of driver's license versus asking people to type things in. So what I love about this kind of framework and this kind of thinking is that if you understand your business well enough to have your vision, understand how to tie together revenue and your business model and your cost structure back to solving a customer problem through your Northstar metric, you can really start to figure out and uncover what your strategy should be. Because it's the things that are going to stand in the way of you not hitting your Northstar or driving your Northstar metric. So some takeaways and tips. Autonomous teams need guardrails to set people in the right direction. So this isn't about autonomous teams going out and doing whatever they want. They need guardrails to make sure they're focused on the right things. Those guardrails, they're sometimes called goals or objectives and key results. Those are things that are derived from data. So Uber's data showed them that, hey, if we can increase our driver to rider ratio, we're going to be able to reduce the amount of time it takes to pick people up. And lastly, the strategy emerges through discovery and experimentation towards your goal. And so they didn't know exactly what they needed to build to be able to accomplish the driver to rider ratio. They needed to figure that out through discovery process. Google's kind of famous for saying they have to try 9 different things before they get it right. It's because they understand this. They understand that there's a ton of uncertainty here, and they understand that we're wrong a lot. And so they're using a discovery process and experimentation process to really understand what it is that they need to build and what's going to impact those metrics. This part's important, tying it all together, because in the previous world, management had a lot of control over what would be happen or what was built within the product. They're losing that control now. Now the teams are deciding what should be built and what needs to, and how they're going to be successful as a product team. And so to be able to connect those things, a common understanding is really critical. We use a product charter document similar to this, and it's really about continuing that alignment that needs to happen across your company. And so as you're creating more autonomy and giving teams freedom, and there's not a bunch of bureaucracy and politics involved in how you're prioritizing what's going to get built, you still need some type of mechanism in place to keep people aligned. And so this document has the vision, the Northstar metric, the strategy. It also has customer pains, like what problems are we trying to solve for? What are the risky assumptions? Like what do we need to validate in discovery? Because if these things aren't accurate, the whole strategy falls over. And then lastly, and those things aren't, with the exception of risky assumptions, aren't changing a whole lot up top. What you're going to have change is this bottom section, your objectives and key results. And so once Uber figured out how to reduce the amount of time it takes to get a ride to under 8 minutes, they moved on to the next thing. Well, what's the next biggest challenge or obstacle that's standing in the way of us improving our Northstar metric? So objectives and key results generally change every 2 to 6 months. There's 2 kinds of key results. There's key results that are focused on data metrics that are for how you're going to measure accomplishing your goal. And so in the case of Uber, it was the driver ratio. As they see that go from 1 to 75, 1 to 65, 1 to 55, they know they're making progress against their objective. The other type of key result are outputs, and these are things like features, capabilities, workflows. So I wanted to share this because everything we've talked about are things that are over here on the left. This is how at Pathfinder we think about idea, like what it looks like to go from idea all the way to your delivery. And over here on the left, you can't really see it, but this is about setting your strategy and your goals and defining the metrics for how you're going to achieve those things. And so that's everything that we've talked about up to this point. There's a process called discovery that is critical in product development because you're helping validate all the assumptions that you have in your plan and in your business case and in your ideas. And that starts with identifying problems. Like, what are the problems that are getting in the way of you achieving this goal. Discovering the problem. So now that we think we have a sense of what the problem is, we need to do more discovery and explore and really truly understand it. I've made this mistake a lot where I thought I understood the problem extremely well, and I go to build something and deliver it to a user or a customer, and the problem that they told me they thought was the problem actually wasn't the problem. So the purpose of this is to actually validate that the problem exists. Discovering the solution. So once you've validated the problem, there's often a lot of different ways you can solve that problem. This step is all about running experiments to make sure that you're solving it in the right way for your users. All of this happens in very lightweight, light touch, or lightweight prototypes. They're very hands-on. I use a lot of even manual queries that will run in email data for building a dashboard. There's a bunch of different MVPs out there that you can use to kind of run experiments. We use, there's a book called Inspired, and we stole an idea from it. The author of that book is Marty Kagan. He worked at Netscape and kind of coined this idea of discovery. He came up with the idea of a dual-track backlog. And so most of you probably have a development backlog today. It's a Kanban board. If you're building software, it has your features that are up next on the left. You've got a column where you pick the card up, and once it's in development, you move it to in progress. Maybe some sign-off, some validation that happens, and then you're moving it to done. The discovery backlog works very similar to that, except in that backlog, the goal isn't to build to earn something, it's to build to learn something. And so you're creating a learning agenda. What do you need to learn about your problem? What do you need to learn about your solution before you actually start development? And the whole purpose of this is so that you can maximize the capacity that you have from a developer's time, so that you're not constantly building the wrong things. The teams that we work with right now, almost everything that's in their development backlog went through the discovery backlog, with the exception of some foundational technical stories that you might need. And so we might have 10 ideas flowing into our discovery backlog. 5 of those might make it into the development backlog. So just recapping those steps, it's setting your vision so that you know where you are headed to in the world you're trying to create. Once you've set your vision, determine the metric that's going to tie together your revenue, your business model, your profit with your customer and value for them. And you're going to do that through your product and your features and your capabilities. Once you've established a Northstar metric, start thinking about all the inputs. What are the leading and lagging indicators that are going to allow you to directly impact that metric? And then lastly, when you start working this way, it's really critical, and product managers are skilled at that, in making sure that you're keeping alignment across everyone, and particularly managing up to executives and to the management team. So I guess it's more than 4 steps, right? We talked about discovery and development. In conclusion, to have a successful strategy, you need to have a vision, you need to have a Northstar metric, and you need to have a measurable goal that your team is trying to work towards to solve. All right. Thanks for having me.
What we're going to do here is we're just going to kind of have a little bit of a Q&A session, and we're going to kind of get kicked off here with Brett when I pull some very hard questions that I've thought of in advance. So you kind of talked about on the slide where you had a lot of different with those things. We talked about on the far left side you had a lot of experiments.
Yeah.
And so you kind of talked about that a little bit. Can you maybe give some examples of like how to run an experiment or of experiments?
Is it still on? Okay.
Still on.
Yeah, one of the things that the Gap was really good at was running experiments. There's one example that I like to use. I like to use it because big companies tend to think that they can't test and move quickly and experiment. And I like fundamentally disagree with that. Our CEO went to a conference, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when same-day shipping was really popular. So Macy's had something, eBay was doing something, Google had something, like it was a very trending thing. And for us, the business case was like $5 million or $5 billion kind of thing, like massive assumptions. We have no idea. But the CEO was still adamant that we move forward with the solution. He's like, this is going to change everything, right? And so he said, okay, let's slow down a little bit. Like, first of all, the investment's pretty significant. Like, we have to build out a bunch of technology, but a bunch of partnerships with local courier networks. Like, it was going to be huge. And so we said, give us 2 weeks to think through this a little bit more. And, excuse me, this is the product management team kind of pushing back at this point. And 3 product managers and some architects, we locked ourselves in a room, started whiteboarding different ideas. And at the time, Gap had like 13 DCs and 2,700 stores. And so it was really difficult. We had no way to predict where any of the inventory was coming from. But we had just bought a brand called Piperlime. And they actually shipped everything from Groveport. It was the only brand that we had that had one single location. And so we geofenced those users so that they could see a same-day shopping experience. So we used Akamai, like an existing product that we could just configure for people with a Columbus IP address. And so we showed them a marketing banner. When they were in checkout, they could see, they could select same-day shipping. The orders would flow through to our order management system. Basically, maybe someday same-day shipping is going to be critical, and there's going to be the demand, and it's going to give us a competitive advantage. 5 or 6 years ago, when we ran this test, that wasn't the case. So the point of it is, like, we were able to, over like a week of whiteboarding and 2 weeks of running a test, avoid a huge opportunity costs of making a massive investment in this feature that really wouldn't have impacted our company at all. And so, we went back to the CEO and said, hey, this isn't going to work. And he said, well, that's really simple. I'm so glad you guys could think of that. Like, I don't think he appreciated how much effort went into it, but that's kind of how MVPs work. So when we think about product discovery and experimentation, it's really thinking like creatively to come up with experiments.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. So you talked a lot about like some of the experiments and some of the obstacles. Can you expand on when teams move from delivering projects to delivering outcomes? What are some obstacles that they run into?
There's obstacles with kind of management level teams, and there's obstacles with the makers. Some of the obstacles that management has is they have less control. They don't have the right experience or background or data to really understand how to set a strategy. Like in the example of Uber, it's really hard to visualize this way of working. If you go to like, I don't know, executives will like fly to Silicon Valley or something, and they'll like hear about this stuff and they get excited about it, but they have a really hard time, like if you've never done it before, like really understanding how it plays out and how it works and how it all comes together. So like operationalizing it can be difficult. For teams, it's probably an easier transition. because they're generally excited about it. Like, one of the things I like most about my job is how excited the developers get when they're like, wait, we don't just get handed a spec doc anymore or like user stories and have to build exactly what our stakeholders are telling us to build. Like, we can actually, we think about this product 40 hours a week. We've been working on it for years. We can start contributing ideas. So generally, those people are really excited. Say the challenges there are just figuring out how to get into the right flow and balance between discovery and delivery. Because now teams are having to do both of those things, where previously they were just in this development mindset.
Great, thank you. So before we open it up for additional questions, what can this audience do to apply what you've talked about the Northstar framework and metric to their life, to their personal life or work life?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I guess I'll take from personal experience. I mean, it helps me to think about like what type of world am I trying to create? Like, what's my vision for my life or for my family? I think that's the starting point, at least. Crafting the actual Northstar metrics probably a little bit different, and I would say, like, with this framework or any framework for that matter, like, you take the things that work for you or for your life or for your company and you apply those things. Like, none of this is here's how to do it, now go and do it, everything will be perfect, right? Like, and I think that probably applies to your life as well if you try to use something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open it up for questions for Brett. So you have two options. You can come up and ask a question to Brett up here, or you can raise your hand and I will come to you with a microphone.
Hi, I thank you for a great presentation and content. I wanted to ask you fast about how, if you can think of a time where you experienced a time where you worked with a team or people in general, where you saw people getting overly attached to some of these strategy management frameworks. I mean, don't get me wrong. I thought, what you showed was compelling and amazing. But I also know that I've been in situations where people constantly, repeat, okay, what about our OKRs,
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about, to see if, you can tell us a little bit about your experience, in that flip side, where people just, keep repeating, but I don't know, maybe there's an over-attachment to those frameworks.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that's the case for frameworks, the case for processes, like Agile, for example, or like there's debates over what your roadmap should look like. And so what seems to help me in cases like that is you're taking a step back and you're asking yourself, like, what job are we hiring this strategy framework to do? Like, why is this important for us? And why are we so is this really helping us or not? What problem is this framework solving? So you're kind of applying the same frameworks, same mindset that you'd have to your product development to your frameworks, so that you're avoiding that just doing a framework to do a framework for the sake of doing a framework. And that's also why I think, like, none of this is like the silver bullet. Like, I think a strategy is important. This is a way that I think, this is one way that I like creating strategy, because it tends to simplify things. And yeah, does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, I think highlighting the problems that it's having, like, what's the bad thing that happens by being too focused on the framework itself, and really understanding like the negative impacts so that you can communicate out like, hey, this is hurting us negatively for these reasons.
Hi, Brett.
Hey.
Kind of picking up on what the lady had asked, what I find when there's no guardrails, by the way, I like that overhead. I thought that was pretty good. What responsibilities does a leader have to encourage the team to explore when there is no data? There are no leading indicators. There are no lagging indicators. And the team's going where no man's gone before. That's a high level of vulnerability. So what kind of pressures does a leader experience in that situation to encourage the team to take the risk of self-organizing, which is kind of a unicorn at times? Everybody talks about self-organizing, but my experience is when there's no guardrails, people start peeing down their pant leg.
Yeah, that's actually where a lot of teams start. Like, great, we love this. This sounds interesting. Of course we want to be outcome focused, but we don't have the data. And so this isn't necessarily like something that just happens overnight. Often that means, okay, well, what data do we need, and how can we start collecting that data, or what instrumentation needs to be in place so that we can start understanding our customer or our workflows better. So there's certainly some dependencies, but it's more about in that case, working with the teams so that they understand where you're trying to get to, and so that they can start incorporating those instrumentation requirements into their design as they're building the product.
Is this still on? Okay, for the makers in the audience, what should they ask of their leaders that they feel some level of protection so they can actually go out and explore and not worry about reprisal? Because it's a sunk cost situation. The money's burning down, and we got to get rolling. So what could people proactively ask of their leaders?
I think that's a really hard conversation to have, honestly. What I found is when people get advice, like when management teams get advice like that, they're really reluctant to listen to it because it's too risky. It's too risky of a change. And where I've seen this type of change happen is when you have someone come in from Google or Amazon or wherever that's worked this way and understands the value in it and is like, this is how we're going to do it. I haven't personally, I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but generally what I found is most of the time when folks come to leadership with, hey, we should start working this way, it doesn't go very far. It's unfortunate, but kind of the reality.
Hey, Brett, there seems to be a challenge in the world to be able to decouple the technology and the solution, in most cases, from the problem. So especially this being a group of developers and doers and makers, what advice would you give people to say how to escalate your language in the right way when having the conversation around these kinds of things with higher level executives and such?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something we always ask. So generally when we start working with teams, these teams are getting requirements from some stakeholder. And so what we start to do is understand, like, okay, why is this, what feature, like, what are you hoping to get out of this? Like, what's your mission? And we'll ask why a couple times. And at the end of that conversation, we'll get to a place where we'll say, oh, okay, so your bet is that if we build this, we're going to have this type of positive result. And so framing it up that way is a really good trick because, one, you're calling it a bet. So you're setting the foundation with them that, hey, this is an assumption, right? And you're also getting to the point where you understand the outcome that they're trying to get to. And so then you can go to a place and say, okay, do you care if we do some research to confirm that this is the right solution that you're proposing?
How often do you recommend the product strategy or vision to be revisited?
Vision, unless you're a startup, vision isn't changing a whole lot. Startups have the advantage of being able to try things out and pivot and trying to find product market fit. So they tend to change their strategy more frequently. If you're a more mature company, your vision's not maybe every 2 years it's changing. The strategy is changing more frequently. And so in the case of Uber, their biggest prohibitor to scaling was hitting that driver to rider ratio. Once they figured out how to unlock that, that was actually an integral part to Uber's success. And so now they could scale to new markets because they knew that they would be able to onboard the right drivers. A big part of that was off the platform and off the product, but their product was in a position where they could hit that goal. And so once they hit their goal, they moved on to the next thing.
And which we thought was a problem could change within 2 years, right? I mean, is that
The vision for the company?
the problem that we're trying to solve for the company?
Yeah.
Break it down to smaller problems.
Yep.
That could change within 2 years.
Yeah, so the bigger vision, like the world you're trying to create, right, is something that stays pretty consistent. All of the problems that are standing in the way of you actually achieving those goals or realizing that vision are changing every day. And so it's having a really good understanding, and that's why the Northstar metric is great, is because if you understand what your Northstar metric is and how you're going, if you believe that it's a leading indicator for sustainable growth, and it always ties back to solving some customer problem, then it's what's the biggest problem standing in our way that's going to have the greatest impact?
Any other questions? Yes.
Pretty simple question, but interested. What is your favorite thing that you've ever built or been a part of building?
Ooh, super nerdy answer here. So, all right, two things. I built a payment platform at Gap. Probably didn't need to build it, honestly, because we could have bought it, but it was one of those projects that we kind of fell in love with, and it ended up being extremely valuable. We could have sold it. The second favorite product I ever built was I was responsible for our payments and credit card program at Gap. So I had a product manager on my team who focused solely on acquisition and retention of those customers and driving world spend. Apple approached us with a partnership and said, hey, look, people aren't using Apple Pay. Do you have any interesting use cases where we can increase the value proposition for Apple Pay? And we said, actually, the two biggest reasons they don't sign up for credit cards is they don't want to hold up the line, and they do not want to, they're scared of being declined in front of people. And so Apple said, well, we actually have all their information on the phone through iTunes. Like, we'll build an integration to your banking partner, Synchrony, and you can tap their phone on an NFC device while they're queued in line at Old Navy, and they enter their salary in and their social security number in, they click submit, and boom, in seconds, they're either approved or declined. And instead of having to wait 2 weeks in the mail to get their physical card, they can use it when they get to the register to pay. And so it was a really slick use case. I loved it because it solved some really big problems. We continued our partnership with them, and we started to say, okay, now that we're top of wallet in Apple Pay, we made more money at Gap and Banana Republic than we did off of our clothes. So we made more money off our credit cards. Nuts. It's weird. We started to say, how do we drive world spend? Like, if you use your Banana Republic card at Target, like, there's interchange that Gap gets for every transaction. It's like 1.5%. And so they wanted to drive their adoption. So they co-funded marketing campaigns with us where they would say, hey, load your Banana Republic card into Apple Pay and get a $10 statement credit. Use it in an Old Navy store and get $10. Use it online through your Safari browser and get another $10 credit. Use it outside of our store, like at any location that takes NFC. We'll give you another $10. And so the whole experiment for us was, what is the cost to try to change their behavior? Like, our hypothesis was if we can retrain these customers, and if we get them to start using this at multiple touch points, instead of using their American Express when they're at Trader Joe's, they're going to tap their phone, and it's going to be our Banana Republic card. And so at the end of that project, we had a really good understanding of the cost of those touch points and the cost to do this type of work. And we also understood what's the behavior that changes like after these multiple touch points. And so we could say, hey, this is a $40 marketing campaign. The world spend goes up like 8 times, and that's worth X dollars. We need to start investing in this. So it was a fun partnership because we got to work with Apple pretty closely on that stuff. By the way, coming from retail, I have a big appreciation for your product, Loop Returns. That was like a $4 billion opportunity for Gap. So rooting for you guys.
One more quick question.
So, one of my favorite sayings in business is the problem your patient brings you is never the real problem. So, that being said, how often do you find that businesses are so screwed up that their basic, I don't want to call it KPI, but their basic idea behind a product isn't actually in line with their mission statement or real business goals? I have this idea in my head that it happens fairly often, but is that a rare thing, or do you see it a lot?
I didn't quite get the connection between the
okay, I'm
part
sorry.
And the
So frequently businesses don't even understand what the real problem is the point. And so frequently they're just kind of grabbing at straws or the most bright, shiny thing that seems like it might bring them some revenue or something like that. And that's not really addressing what the real problems are. And frequently that might be because they don't even understand how to connect what they think that they want to do with their main, what they should be doing.
Yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, I think probably most of us in the room have made that mistake. I certainly have, where I've chased the shiny object or whatever it is, or maybe I thought I understood the problem. Like, I've built an entire platform once based on what users were telling me was the problem. Fortunately, it was an MVP, but it was 3 months of development time. When I got it out there, no one was using it. I'm like, well, you told me this was your problem, and this is what we built, and we showed you. You're like, well, actually, this is what I needed. And so, I think that's very common. I think it takes incredible discipline and rigor to really be diligent about understanding the problem. That's why I'm such an advocate for product management, because I think that's what it brings to the table.
Once I saw, not to go on with a long story because I know we're at the end of time, but once I saw a group that made the colors of the UI of a new web thing that supported their entire company based upon the CEO's favorite color palette that turned out to not be visible to people who were colorblind. Oof. And they didn't realize that until the unveiling of the thing, where there happened to be some people from the company that never touched it before that said, hey, wait, I don't see that quite the same as you. And so they had to go throw $200,000 or $300,000 at it to redo the UI.
We've probably all experienced something like that, and that's why we push product discovery so much, is to uncover those assumptions and validate the solution. Yeah.
Great. Big round of applause for Brett.
Thanks.
So real quick before we break,